An atheist father takes his daughter to church for a promise. What happens at the altar brings him to his knees. Logic and faith are incompatible, Dr. James Wilson declared, his voice echoing through the packed university auditorium. I stand here today not just as a professor of religious psychology, but as a father who believes in raising children with reason, not fairy tales. The audience nodded in agreement, scribbling notes furiously as he continued his famous lecture on the psychological cost of religious indoctrination. Little did he know that in 3 months he would be on his knees at a church altar praying for the first time in his life. Not because he found God, but because sometimes a father's love can shatter even the strongest walls of disbelief. And sometimes the hardest prayers come from those who don't believe in prayer at all. This is a story of how a man's unwavering certainty crumbled in the face of his daughter's simple faith, and how a community learned that the greatest miracles often happen in the hearts of those who deny their existence. For now, though, Dr. Wilson stood confidently at the podium, unaware that his entire world was about to change, not through divine intervention, but through a series of events that would force him to question everything he thought he knew about faith, love, and the thin line between reason and hope. Take a moment to let us know where you're watching from and hit that like button before we dive into this touching story of faith, love, and transformation. Your engagement means everything. Dr. James Wilson stood at the pinnacle of academic success, a former Harvard professor of religious psychology whose research on faith and human behavior had made him a lightning rod in debates about religion and reason. At 52, his salt and pepper hair and wire-rimmed glasses gave him an air of distinguished authority, while his articulate speaking style and razor-sharp logic had earned him both devoted followers and fierce critics in the academic world. His reputation as America's most prominent academic atheist was built not just on his scholarly work, but on his personal story. 5 years ago, his wife Sarah Wilson, a devout Catholic and beloved local kindergarten teacher, died in a tragic car accident while driving home from evening mass. Her death became a turning point in James's relationship with faith, transforming his academic skepticism into a personal crusade against religious belief. Sarah had been his opposite in many ways. Where he saw the world through the lens of data and empirical evidence, she found meaning in faith and tradition. Their love had transcended these differences until her final days, when she made a last request that he would raise their daughter Emily in the Catholic faith. It was the one promise he couldn't keep, the one time he chose his principles over her wishes. Emily Wilson, now 12, inherited her mother's gentle spirit and her father's quick mind. With long brown hair often tied in a messy ponytail and bright green eyes that seemed to hold both curiosity and compassion, she navigated between her father's world of facts and her fading memories of her mother's faith. Despite her young age, she showed remarkable sensitivity to both perspectives, never fully rejecting either one. Father Michael Thompson, the aging priest at St. Mary's Catholic Church, knew Sarah well and had watched the Wilson family's tragedy unfold. In his 30 years of ministry, he had seen many cases of lost faith, but James's transformation from respectful skeptic to vocal atheist troubled him deeply. At 70, with kind blue eyes and weathered hands that had blessed thousands, he continued to pray for the day James would find his way back to the church. Dr. Rebecca Anderson served as the head of pediatric oncology at St. Mary's Medical Center, the Catholic hospital where Sarah had volunteered. A brilliant doctor with 2 decades of experience, she balanced medical expertise with deep empathy. Her own past as a former missionary doctor in Africa gave her a unique perspective on the intersection of faith and science. These core characters moved in the orbit of St. Michael's Parish, a tight-knit Catholic community in suburban Boston where the Wilson family had lived for 15 years. Here, James's public stance on religion had transformed him from a respected neighbor to a controversial figure, though many still remembered him as the loving husband who had supported his wife's faith even while disagreeing with it. The nurses at St. Mary's Medical Center still spoke of Sarah's volunteer work in the children's ward, where she had spent countless hours reading stories and bringing comfort to sick children. Her absence left a void that even years couldn't fill, and her memory cast a long shadow over both the hospital and the church community she had loved so dearly. In the years following Sarah's death, James had thrown himself into his work, publishing books and giving lectures that earned him the nickname the Faith Destroyer in religious circles. Yet those who knew him well could see that beneath his logical arguments and confident declarations lay a deep wound that had never fully healed. His crusade against religion seemed driven less by intellectual conviction than by a personal pain he couldn't quite acknowledge. These were the players in a drama about to unfold, each carrying their own beliefs, wounds, and hopes into a story that would test the boundaries between faith and reason, love and logic, tragedy and redemption. None of them could have predicted how their lives would intertwine in the coming months, or how their beliefs would be challenged by events that defied both scientific explanation and religious doctrine. The tragedy that shattered the Wilson family occurred on a rainy Tuesday evening in October 5 years ago. Sarah Wilson's car spun out of control on the wet roads just half a mile from St. Mary's Church, where she had just finished organizing a fundraiser for the Children's Hospital wing. The cruel irony wasn't lost on anyone. She died mere steps from the sacred ground where she had spent so much of her life praying for others' safety. The Wilsons' Victorian home, once filled with the warmth of compromise between faith and reason, still stood proudly on Maple Street, just 3 blocks from both the church and the prestigious Riverside Academy, where James now taught. Sarah's touches remained everywhere: the small cross above Emily's bed that James couldn't bring himself to remove, her garden of peace lilies that Emily tenderly maintained, and her collection of religious books that gathered dust in the study James rarely entered. In the conservative community of St. Michael's Parish, the Wilsons had once been seen as a model of how faith and skepticism could coexist in harmony. Sarah's dedication to the church was matched by James's respectful attendance at important ceremonies, even if he remained quietly unconvinced. Their love had been a testament to the possibility of bridging seemingly insurmountable differences through understanding and respect. The community itself was deeply rooted in tradition, with St. Mary's Church and its affiliated medical center serving as its heart. Most families had lived there for generations, their lives revolving around church activities, school functions, and the changing seasons marked by religious festivals. It was a place where everyone knew each other's stories, where casseroles appeared on doorsteps during times of trouble, and where faith was as natural as breathing. Sarah's death changed everything. The community's initial outpouring of support slowly turned to whispers of concern as James's grief transformed into a public rejection of faith. His first book, The Illusion of Comfort: How Religious Faith Fails Us When We Need It Most, had caused many of their old friends to distance themselves. Some saw it as a betrayal of Sarah's memory, others as a cry for help from a man lost in grief. The promise James couldn't keep haunted the edges of their life. On her deathbed, Sarah had clutched his hand and whispered, "Promise me you'll keep Emily close to God." He had remained silent, tears streaming down his face, unable to make a vow he knew he would break. That moment of refusal lived in his memory alongside the hope in Sarah's eyes, a hope that died hours before she did. Emily grew up in this complex landscape of memory and absence, faith and doubt. At school, other children sometimes asked her about her father's books or her mother's death, questions she deflected with a grace beyond her years. She found her own quiet ways to remember her mother secretly keeping a small prayer book in her backpack, or sometimes walking past the church after school just to sit in its shadows. The community's relationship with the Wilsons had evolved into a delicate dance of politeness and underlying tension. They were still invited to community events, though James rarely attended. The church ladies still included Emily in their prayers, though they did so quietly. And Father Michael still left the church doors open late on Tuesday evenings, the time Sarah used to come for private prayer, hoping that one day James might walk through them. This was the world in which their story would unfold, a world where faith and doubt, love and loss, community and isolation all intertwined in the complex tapestry of daily life. It was a setting prime for either miracle or tragedy, where the lines between belief and skepticism were about to be tested in ways that would challenge every conviction and question every certainty. In this carefully balanced ecosystem of faith and reason, it would take just one event to tip the scales and set in motion a chain of events that would force everyone to reconsider what they believed about miracles, truth, and the power of love to bridge the deepest divides. The first sign something was wrong came during Emily's soccer practice. She collapsed on the field, her usually rosy cheeks pale as paper. At first, James dismissed it as simple exhaustion. Emily had always pushed herself hard, a trait she inherited from him. But when the nosebleed started, followed by unexplained bruises blooming across her skin like watercolor stains, the analytical part of his brain couldn't ignore the pattern any longer. The waiting room at St. Mary's Medical Center felt like a cruel joke of fate. It was the only hospital within 50 miles with a renowned pediatric department, the same department where Sarah had volunteered countless hours. James sat rigid in an uncomfortable plastic chair watching Emily flip through an old magazine with forced casualness, trying not to think about how many times Sarah had comforted other parents in this very room. Dr. Rebecca Anderson delivered the diagnosis with gentle professionalism: acute lymphoblastic leukemia. The words fell like stones in the sterile office, each syllable echoing with devastating clarity. Emily, displaying that uncanny maturity that sometimes frightened James, asked calmly about treatment options while he sat frozen, his academic's mind struggling to process statistics and survival rates that suddenly felt meaningless. The initial rejection from St. Mary's Financial Assistance Program came swiftly and without explanation. James's insurance would cover only a portion of the experimental treatment Emily needed. His professor's salary, while comfortable, couldn't begin to touch the astronomical costs. The irony wasn't lost on him. The hospital his wife had devoted herself to was now turning their backs on her daughter. The news spread through the community like wildfire. At Riverside Academy, James noticed the sideways glances, the hushed conversations that stopped when he entered the faculty lounge. Some colleagues awkwardly offered prayers, which he acknowledged with tight-lipped nods, while others suggested alternative treatments with an enthusiasm that bordered on desperation. In the grocery store, Mrs. Patterson, who had known Sarah since kindergarten, cornered James in the cereal aisle. Perhaps she suggested with well-meaning but misplaced confidence, "This is God's way of bringing you back to Him." James had never been more grateful for his years of debate training had helped him walk away instead of responding with the fury that burned in his chest. The church community's response was equally complex. Prayer circles formed, though no one quite knew how to tell James about them. Father Michael made a quiet visit to the house, offering support without pushing faith, but James could see the hope in the old priest's eyes, hope that this crisis might accomplish what reason and argument had failed to do. Emily watched it all with those observant green eyes that seemed to hold more wisdom than her 12 years should allow. She noticed how her father's hand shook slightly when reading medical reports late at night, how his voice took on a brittle quality when discussing treatment options. She saw the strain in his smile when he assured her everything would be fine, and the darkness in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. The breaking point came during a routine blood draw. As the nurse struggled to find a vein in Emily's increasingly frail arm, James caught his daughter whispering something under her breath. It was the Hail Mary, a prayer she must have learned from Sarah years ago. For a moment he was transported back to quiet evenings when Sarah would tuck Emily into bed, their soft murmurs of prayer drifting down the hallway, while he pretended not to hear. That evening James sat in his study, surrounded by his books on psychology and religious behavior, his academic papers on the illogic of faith. On his computer screen, medical journal articles about leukemia treatment competed with his own writings about the false comfort of religion. The dissonance was deafening. Here he sat, America's most prominent academic atheist, watching his carefully constructed worldview crumble in the face of his daughter's illness. The statistics and studies that had once seemed so definitive now felt hollow. His logical arguments against faith offered no comfort in the dark hours of the night when Emily's cough echoed through their too-quiet house. For the first time since Sarah's death, James Wilson, the great debunker of religious comfort, found himself wishing he could believe in something, anything that might save his daughter. It happened on a Sunday morning as James was preparing Emily's medications. "Dad," she said, her voice small but steady, "before we start the treatments, I want to go to church." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. James's hand stilled on the pill organizer, his mind racing through all the reasons to refuse, yet unable to voice any of them in the face of his daughter's quiet determination. "Mom used to say that faith is like a warm blanket on a cold night," Emily continued, her fingers tracing the pattern on her bedspread, the same one Sarah had picked out years ago. "I know you don't believe in it, Dad, but I need that blanket right now." The metaphor, so simple yet profound, struck James like a physical blow. It was exactly the kind of thing Sarah would have said. James found himself agreeing before he could fully process the implications. The look of relief on Emily's face made his discomfort seem insignificant. As they drove to St. Mary's Church that afternoon, he couldn't help but remember all the Sunday mornings he'd dropped Sarah off at this same entrance, always with a kiss and a gentle debate about joining her inside. The whispers started the moment they entered the church. James Wilson, the infamous atheist professor, walking into Sunday Mass with his dying daughter. He saw phones discreetly emerging from pockets, no doubt sending texts that would ripple through the community within minutes. Emily either didn't notice or chose to ignore it, her focus entirely on the altar ahead. Father Michael's surprise was evident, but the old priest recovered quickly, welcoming them with a warmth that made James's defensiveness feel suddenly petty. The familiar scent of incense and wooden pews brought back memories he'd thought safely buried Sarah in her Sunday best, Emily as a toddler fascinated by the flickering candles, countless Christmas services he'd attended out of love, rather than belief. As Emily knelt at the altar, James stood awkwardly behind her, acutely aware of the stares from the congregation. Some faces showed sympathy, others judgment, and a few, the ones that bothered him most, showed triumph, as if his presence proved some victory of faith over reason. He wanted to explain that he was here for Emily, not God, but the words stuck in his throat as he watched his daughter pray. Her prayer, when it came, shattered his intellectual defenses completely. "God," she whispered loud enough for him to hear, "I know Dad doesn't believe in you, but Mom did. And she was the smartest person I knew besides Dad, of course." A small laugh, then a suppressed cough. "I'm not asking you to make me better. I'm asking you to help Dad remember how to hope again. He's forgotten since Mom left." The simplicity of her prayer, free from the theological complexity he'd spent years arguing against, touched something deep within James. He found himself remembering Sarah's words from years ago. "Faith isn't about having all the answers, James. Sometimes it's just about having the courage to ask the questions." As they left the church, Emily's hand warm in his, James noticed Father Michael watching them with an expression he couldn't quite read. The priest made no attempt to speak with them, but his eyes held a knowledge that made James uncomfortable, as if he understood something about this moment that James himself didn't yet grasp. The drive home was silent, but it was a different kind of silence than the tense ones that had filled their house since the diagnosis. Emily dozed in the passenger seat, looking more peaceful than she had in weeks. James gripped the steering wheel, his mind a battlefield of conflicting thoughts. He was a man of science, of reason, of provable facts. Yet watching his daughter pray had awakened something he thought long buried, not faith exactly, but perhaps a memory of what faith felt like through Sarah's eyes. That night, as he tucked Emily into bed, she asked, "Can we go back next Sunday?" James hesitated, years of intellectual opposition warring with the simple desire to give his daughter whatever comfort she sought. "We'll see," he answered, knowing even as he said it that he would give in. Some battles, he was beginning to learn, weren't worth fighting, especially when the opponent was love itself. If this story has touched your heart so far, a simple like would mean the world to us. Let's continue exploring how one father's love challenges everything he believes in. The meeting with Robert Parker, head of St. Mary's Hospital Board of Directors, was scheduled for 9 a.m. on a Tuesday, the same day of the week Sarah had died. James noticed this detail with the kind of sharp irony that seemed to define his life lately. Parker's office, with its carefully curated display of religious artifacts and charitable awards, felt like a stage set for the conversation that followed. Dr. Wilson Parker began, his expensive pen tapping against Emily's application. "While we sympathize with your situation, the hospital's charitable fund has specific guidelines." The pause before guidelines carried the weight of unspoken judgment. "Our donors expect their contributions to support families who share our values and mission." James felt his throat tighten. "My wife dedicated years to this hospital," he managed, his academic's vocabulary failing him in the face of such calculated rejection. "Sarah believed in everything this institution stands for." The mention of his wife's name caused Parker to shift uncomfortably in his leather chair, but his expression remained impassive. "Ah, yes," Sarah Parker's voice softened with practiced sympathy. "She was truly an angel among us, which makes your public stance on matters of faith all the more troubling." He slid a printout across the desk, a recent article where James had criticized religious institutions' influence in healthcare. "How can we justify using Catholic donors' money to support someone who actively works to undermine our beliefs?" The meeting deteriorated from there. James watched as years of his academic arguments against religion were weaponized against his daughter's chance for treatment. Each point he'd made in lectures and books was quoted back to him with devastating precision. His reputation as the faith destroyer had come back to haunt him in the most cruel way possible. As he left Parker's office, James noticed a small plaque on the wall, a quote about charity and compassion. The irony made him pause long enough to see Father Michael emerging from the hospital chapel. The old priest took one look at James's face and understood. "Come with me," he said quietly, leading James to his modest office in the hospital's pastoral care department. Over coffee in chipped mugs, Father Michael revealed the deeper currents beneath the surface. Parker's guidelines were relatively new, implemented after he'd taken control of the board 2 years ago. Several staff members had raised concerns about the increasing rigidity of the assistance program, but investigations mysteriously stalled. "This isn't about faith," James Father Michael said, his weathered hands wrapped around his coffee mug. Sarah would have been the first to say that true charity doesn't ask about the recipient's beliefs. He hesitated, then added, "There have been irregularities in the fund's disbursement, questions about where some of the money is really going." James felt a familiar analytical clarity cutting through his emotional fog. "You're suggesting corruption." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Father Michael's silence was answer enough. "Why haven't you reported it?" The priest's smile was tired. "With what proof? And to whom? Parker's brother-in-law sits on the diocesan council. His family has donated millions to the hospital." He sighed, suddenly looking every one of his 70 years. "I've been encouraging an audit, quietly pushing for transparency. Last week I was informed that my retirement date has been moved up. Apparently I'm needed for special projects in the diocese." As James processed this information, he felt the ground shifting beneath his carefully constructed worldview. The institution he'd criticized for its faith was failing not because of its religious beliefs, but because of human greed. And the man of faith sitting across from him was fighting not with prayers, but with a determined search for truth. Before James could respond, his phone buzzed a text from Emily's nurse. His daughter was asking for him. As he stood to leave, Father Michael pressed a flash drive into his hand. "Sarah kept records," he said softly, "of everything. She saw things, working in the children's ward. I've been gathering more since we lost her, just in case someone brave enough to use them came along." James stared at the small device, feeling its weight in his palm. "Why me?" he asked. "I'm the last person who'd want to help protect a religious institution." Father Michael's eyes twinkled with a hint of his old humor. "Perhaps because you're the only one who has nothing left to lose by telling the truth. Besides," he added gently, "Sarah always said you were the most honest man she knew." The Sunday following Parker's rejection dawned cold and clear. The morning light filtered through St. Mary's stained glass windows, casting kaleidoscope shadows across Emily's pale face as she made her way to the altar. The church was unusually full. Word had spread about the Wilson family's regular attendance, drawing both the curious and the judgmental. Emily knelt at the altar, her frail body seeming smaller than ever in the vast space. James stood behind her, his usual protective distance feeling inadequate in the face of what was to come. She had insisted on coming, despite the fever that had kept her up most of the night. Sometimes, she had told him with Sarah's gentle wisdom, you need to be weak before you can be strong. Her prayer began softly, but in the hushed church, every word carried. "Dear God," she started, her voice trembling slightly, "I know people think Dad and I shouldn't be here. They think because Dad doesn't believe in you, we don't deserve help." A murmur rippled through the congregation. James felt his hands clench at his sides. "But Mom used to say that love is stronger than doubt. She said that when you really love someone, you try to understand them, even when they see the world differently." Emily's voice grew stronger. "I don't know if I'm going to get better. But I know that every time Dad brings me here, even though it hurts him, he's choosing love over doubt. Isn't that what you want us to do?" James felt something break inside him, not his disbelief, but perhaps the wall he'd built around his grief. Tears he'd held back since Sarah's funeral began falling silently. He watched them darken the shoulder of his jacket, each one carrying years of stored pain. From the corner of his eye he saw Mrs. Patterson, who had been so quick to judge, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Mr. Collins, who had stopped speaking to him after his first book was published, was staring at his folded hands with an expression of deep shame. Even Robert Parker, sitting in his usual front row seat, seemed to squirm uncomfortably. Emily continued, her voice now clear and strong despite her weakness. "So I'm not asking you to make me better, though that would be nice. A small ripple of tearful laughter moved through the church. I'm asking you to help everyone see what Mom saw, that love doesn't need proof. It just needs a chance." As she finished, something extraordinary happened. A shift in the morning clouds sent a beam of sunlight through the rose window above the altar. It bathed Emily in a spectrum of colors, creating what looked like a halo around her thin frame. James, the skeptic who had spent years debunking miraculous occurrences, found himself transfixed by the simple beauty of the moment. Father Michael, who had been watching silently from the side, stepped forward. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of decades of ministry. "Emily Wilson has given us all a lesson today," he announced, his eyes sweeping the congregation. "Not about the nature of belief, but about the nature of love. And perhaps that is the greatest miracle of all." The silence that followed was profound. It was broken only by the sound of footsteps as Mrs. Patterson rose from her pew and walked to where Emily knelt. She placed her hand on the girl's shoulder and whispered something that made Emily smile. One by one, others followed, the very people who had shunned them now drawn forward by the pure wisdom of a child's faith. James watched, overwhelmed, as his daughter became the center of a growing circle of support. He saw Robert Parker slip quietly out a side door, avoiding the scene of spontaneous communion. But more importantly, he saw his community transforming before his eyes, barriers of judgment crumbling in the face of simple truth. As Emily finally stood, weakened but glowing with an inner light that reminded him painfully of Sarah, James realized that something fundamental had shifted. Not in his beliefs — he was still the scientist, the skeptic, the questioner — but perhaps in his understanding of what faith truly meant to those who held it. And in that moment, watching his daughter accept hugs from people who had only recently shunned them, he felt closer to understanding Sarah than he had since her death. The flash drive Father Michael had given James turned out to be a Pandora's box of revelations. Late into the night, after Emily had fallen asleep, he pored over Sarah's meticulous records. His wife, it seemed, had been more than just a volunteer. She had been quietly documenting discrepancies in the hospital's charitable fund for years. Spreadsheets, emails, and careful notes painted a picture of systematic corruption that made his hands shake with rage. Parker's guidelines for the charitable fund were merely the tip of the iceberg. Millions of dollars meant for patient care had been redirected through a maze of shell charities, eventually finding their way back to companies owned by board members' families. The evidence was circumstantial, but damning, especially when combined with the additional documentation Father Michael had gathered since Sarah's death. Most disturbing were the patterns of rejection. Families had been denied assistance not just for religious reasons, but based on race, social status, and political affiliations. All while the hospital's marketing materials touted their commitment to serving all of God's children. The hypocrisy was staggering, even to James's cynical expectations. As he dug deeper, a chilling possibility emerged. Sarah's accident had occurred the night she stayed late at the hospital reviewing financial records. The police report noted brake failure as the cause, but her maintenance record showed the car had been serviced just days before. James found himself staring at his computer screen at 3 a.m., wondering if he'd stumbled upon something far darker than simple corruption. Father Michael's forced retirement took effect swiftly. The announcement came during Sunday Mass, presented as a celebration of his service. But James noticed how the old priest's hands trembled as he delivered his final sermon, a pointed message about the difference between institutional power and true faith that had Parker shifting uncomfortably in his pew. The community's reaction to these events split along unexpected lines. Some of the most devout parishioners, including Mrs. Patterson, began asking uncomfortable questions about the hospital's practices. Others, particularly those with business ties to Parker's family, doubled down on their support of the administration. The church, once a unified force in the community, began to fracture. Emily's condition became the catalyst for these divisions to surface publicly. When word spread that she had been denied assistance despite qualifying under the hospital's published guidelines, longtime church members began challenging the board's decisions. Letters appeared in the local newspaper, questioning how a Catholic institution could turn away a sick child based on her father's beliefs. Parker's response was swift and calculated. He called an emergency board meeting where he presented James's academic work as evidence of an orchestrated attack on the hospital's religious character. The meeting, meant to be private, was leaked to the local press. Soon, what had been a local controversy exploded into a regional story. Atheist professor attacks Catholic hospital while seeking treatment for daughter. The media attention brought unexpected allies. Other families who had been denied assistance began coming forward with their stories. A group of Catholic healthcare advocates reached out to James, offering support and legal counsel. Even some of his academic colleagues, who had long disagreed with his stance on religion, spoke out against the hospital's actions. Through it all, Emily continued to attend Sunday Mass, her quiet presence a rebuke to those who tried to make the controversy about faith versus reason. Her strength seemed to flow from a deeper source than either religious belief or rational thought. "Mom always said that truth doesn't pick sides," she told James one evening. "It just waits to be found." James found himself navigating an impossible situation. Every piece of evidence he uncovered felt like a potential weapon, one that could bring justice but might also destroy the institution his wife had loved and his daughter still found comfort in. The scientist in him knew that truth was paramount, but Sarah's voice in his memory reminded him that truth without compassion could be its own form of corruption. The breaking point came when he discovered records suggesting that Parker had been embezzling from the Children's Cancer Fund specifically. The same fund that could have covered Emily's treatment had been systematically drained to finance Parker's lavish lifestyle. The irony was almost too perfect. The man who had rejected them on moral grounds was himself stealing from sick children. Late one night, staring at his wall of evidence, James remembered something Sarah used to say about the nature of faith. True faith isn't afraid of questions, just as true science isn't afraid of mystery. He realized that exposing the corruption wouldn't be an attack on faith, it would be a defense of the true principles the hospital claimed to represent. But as he prepared to take action, Emily's condition took a turn for the worse. The timing couldn't have been more critical. Going public with the evidence might bring down Parker's corrupt administration, but it could also disrupt the hospital's operations at a time when Emily needed them most. James found himself facing the ultimate test of his principles: risk his daughter's immediate care for the chance at justice, or stay silent and let corruption continue to harm other families. The answer came from an unexpected source. While visiting Father Michael at his modest retirement apartment, James noticed a framed quote on the wall, words from Sarah's favorite saint: "The truth is like a lion. You don't have to defend it. Let it loose and it will defend itself." Looking at those words, James finally understood what both Sarah and Emily had been trying to teach him: that truth and faith, when genuine, served the same master justice. Emily's health declined with a cruel predictability that tormented James's scientific mind. Each blood test, each medical report told a story he could track with graphs and statistics, yet was powerless to change. The leukemia was advancing more rapidly than the doctors had predicted, and without the specialized treatment they couldn't afford, the prognosis grew darker with each passing week. In the quiet hours of the night, when Emily's labored breathing echoed through their too-empty house, James found himself drawn to Sarah's old Bible, still sitting untouched on her bedside table. He didn't open it for faith or comfort, but because her fingerprints remained visible on its well-worn cover. Sometimes he fell asleep with his hand resting on it, as if somehow he could reach through time and feel her guidance once more. The dream started then, vivid recreations of their last conversation. Sarah in her hospital bed, pale but determined, making him promise to keep Emily close to God. In reality, he had remained silent, unable to make a vow he knew he would break. But in his dreams he found himself saying yes over and over, only to wake with tears on his face and guilt in his heart. Emily watched him with eyes that grew more knowing as her body grew weaker. She never complained about the pain, never questioned why they couldn't afford the treatment others received. Instead, she wrote in a journal Sarah had given her, filling pages with thoughts she wouldn't share. Once, James caught a glimpse: "Mom, I think Dad's starting to understand. Not about God maybe, but about why you believed." The academic community that had once celebrated him now seemed distant and irrelevant. His publisher called about the deadline for his next book, a critique of religious influence in healthcare. The irony made him laugh until he cried. How could he write about the failures of faith-based healing while watching his daughter find comfort in the very beliefs he'd spent years dissecting? His colleagues at Riverside Academy treated him with a careful kindness that felt worse than criticism. They avoided mentioning religion around him now, as if his personal crisis might invalidate his academic work. Only Dr. Anna Martinez, an oncologist turned professor, dared to challenge him directly. "James, what if you're both right? What if reason and faith are just different languages describing the same truth?" The church community's response continued to evolve. Some, like Mrs. Patterson, became unexpected allies, bringing meals and offering to sit with Emily during James's teaching hours. Others maintained their distance as if doubt itself might be contagious. Father Michael, even in retirement, called regularly to check on them, his gentle wisdom a bridge between the worlds James was struggling to reconcile. Emily's quiet faith remained constant, even as her physical strength waned. She insisted on attending Mass when she could, and on the days she was too weak, she asked James to read from Sarah's prayer book. He did so mechanically at first, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. But gradually he found himself paying attention to their poetry, their ancient attempt to make sense of suffering and love. One evening, after a particularly difficult day of treatments, Emily asked the question James had been dreading. "Dad, if I die like Mom, will you stop believing in everything?" The simplicity of her question cut through all his intellectual defenses. "I never stopped believing in love," he answered, surprising himself with the truth of it. "And that's what your mother really believed in too." The weight of Sarah's absence felt heavier as Emily's illness progressed. James found himself talking to her in empty rooms, asking questions that had no answers. How had she balanced faith and reason so gracefully? How had she known that love was more important than being right? The silence that followed these questions felt less empty somehow, as if the very act of asking them was changing something within him. His crisis of faith became not about believing in God, but about believing in anything at all. The careful structures of logic and evidence he'd built his life upon seemed to crumble in the face of his daughter's simple courage. What good was being right if it left you alone? What value was truth if it couldn't save the people you loved? Yet through it all, Emily continued to write in her journal, continued to pray, continued to believe in something larger than their immediate reality. Mom used to say that faith is like a seed, she told him one night. It grows in the dark when you can't see it happening. Looking at her peaceful face against the hospital pillows, James wondered if perhaps he'd been so busy arguing about the existence of gardens that he'd missed watching the flowers grow. The day Emily was too weak to attend Mass, the church came to her. Led by Mrs. Patterson and Father Michael, a small group gathered in their living room, bringing with them the familiar rhythms of prayer and song. James stood at the edges of this impromptu congregation, watching his daughter's face light up with joy, and felt something shift inside him. Not belief exactly, but perhaps understanding of why Sarah had loved these rituals, of why Emily found peace in them, of why some questions didn't need answers to be meaningful. The morning James decided to expose the corruption dawned cold and gray, matching his resolve. He had spent the night organizing Sarah's evidence, cross-referencing Father Michael's documents, and preparing a comprehensive report that would be impossible to ignore. The irony wasn't lost on him. He, the great skeptic, was about to become a defender of a Catholic institution's true mission. He began by sending copies of the evidence to three entities: the State Attorney General's office, a respected investigative journalist at the Boston Globe, and the Diocese's Oversight Committee. Each package included a detailed timeline of the corruption, starting with Sarah's initial discoveries and ending with Parker's recent decisions. He also included a personal letter explaining his complicated position as both critic and advocate. The response was immediate and explosive. By noon, the hospital's board of directors had called an emergency meeting. James watched from his office at Riverside Academy as news vans began appearing in the hospital parking lot. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from colleagues, journalists, and church members, but the only call he answered was from Emily's nurse, assuring him that his daughter's care would not be interrupted. Parker's attempt at damage control backfired spectacularly. In a hastily called press conference, he tried to paint James as a bitter atheist with a vendetta against religious institutions. But when reporters began asking specific questions about financial discrepancies, Parker's composed facade crackled. The moment he snapped at a reporter asking about the Children's Cancer Fund, James knew the tide had turned. The hospital staff, long silenced by fear and institutional pressure, began speaking out. Nurses provided additional documentation of rejected assistance applications. Administrative assistants confirmed irregular financial transactions. Even board members, sensing the shifting winds, started distancing themselves from Parker's decisions. Father Michael emerged from retirement like an avenging angel, his quiet dignity lending weight to the accusations. In a written statement to the press, he revealed his own role in gathering evidence and, more importantly, spoke about Sarah's dedication to uncovering the truth. She believed, he wrote, that true faith requires honesty, even when that honesty forces us to confront our failures. The diocese, facing mounting public pressure, announced an independent investigation. Parker was placed on administrative leave, though many felt this was too little, too late. The hospital's charitable funds were frozen pending audit, creating a new crisis for families depending on assistance. James found himself in the unexpected position of advocating for emergency funding to keep aid flowing to current recipients. Through it all, Emily watched from her hospital bed with a wisdom that continued to humble him. "Mom would be proud," she said, studying the newspaper headlines. "Not because you exposed bad things, but because you're helping protect something good." Her words echoed Sarah's own philosophy that criticism without love was just destruction. The community's response transformed from scandal to action. Led by Mrs. Patterson and other church members, a grassroots campaign began raising funds for families affected by the frozen charitable accounts. Local businesses held fundraisers. Other religious institutions offered support. The crisis had revealed not just corruption, but also the depth of compassion within the community. James found himself working alongside people he had once dismissed as blindly faithful, discovering that their commitment to justice matched his own dedication to truth. Together, they began building a new framework for the hospital's charitable programs, one based on transparency, fairness, and genuine compassion, rather than performative piety. As the investigation expanded, darker truths emerged about the night of Sarah's accident. While nothing could be proven definitively, enough questions were raised to warrant a separate investigation. James chose not to pursue it, understanding finally that Sarah's legacy wasn't about finding every answer, but about asking the right questions. The day Parker resigned, Father Michael visited James in his office. The old priest looked tired but satisfied, He said, settling into a chair, "Sarah once told me she married you because you were the most honest man she'd ever met. She said your doubt was more genuine than most people's faith." He paused, smiling slightly. "She would have loved seeing you fight for this place." The day of Emily's surgery arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that New England winters specialize in. In the pre-dawn darkness, James helped his daughter pack her small hospital bag, including Sarah's prayer book and the journal that had become her constant companion. The weight of what lay ahead settled around them like a heavy snow. St. Mary's Hospital, still reeling from the corruption scandal, had undergone a rapid transformation. An interim board, led by respected community members including Father Michael, had expedited approval for Emily's treatment under a newly transparent assistance program. The timing felt like either divine intervention or cosmic irony. James wasn't sure which, and for once the distinction didn't seem important. Dr. Rebecca Anderson met them in the surgical prep area, her calm professionalism an anchor in the storm of uncertainty. "We've assembled the best team," she assured them, reviewing the procedure details one final time. And she added with a slight smile, "We have quite a few people in the chapel sending their support." James nodded, acknowledging without words the comfort this might bring his daughter. Emily, pale but composed, squeezed James's hand as the pre-op medications began to take effect. "Dad," she whispered, her voice already drowsy, "will you read to me from Mom's book? Just until I fall asleep." James opened the worn prayer book, his throat tight. He began reading, not really registering the words until he reached a passage Sarah had underlined, "Perfect love casts out fear." The surgical waiting room filled with an unexpected crowd. Mrs. Patterson arrived with coffee and muffins, organizing an impromptu support group. Professor Martinez from Riverside Academy came bearing academic journals to keep your mind occupied, she said. Even some of Parker's former allies appeared, their presence a quiet acknowledgement of changed perspectives. Father Michael set up a quiet corner for those who wished to pray, while respectfully ensuring James had space to pace and process in his own way. The blend of sacred and secular support would have seemed impossible just months ago. Now it felt like the most natural thing in the world, a community united not by belief but by love for a child who had taught them all about faith. Hours ticked by with excruciating slowness. Each update from the surgical team was analyzed from both medical and miraculous perspectives. James found himself in the strange position of drawing comfort from both the statistical probability data and the fervent prayers being offered. Sarah, he realized, would have appreciated the symmetry. The first sign that something was wrong came 6 hours into the procedure. Dr. Anderson emerged, her surgical mask still in place, eyes serious above it. "There's been a complication," she began, and James felt the room collectively hold its breath. "Emily's body is fighting the transplant. We need to make some decisions, and quickly." The next few minutes blurred into a stream of medical terminology and risk assessments. James, the rational scientist, understood each word individually, but their combination felt like a foreign language. He found himself staring at Sarah's prayer book, still clutched in his hand, as if it might offer a translation. Then, in the midst of this crisis, something remarkable happened. Dr. Anderson, known for her purely scientific approach, paused in her explanation of treatment options. "James," she said softly before we proceed, "is there anyone you need to consult? Any guidance you need to seek?" The question, with its careful acknowledgement of both medical and spiritual dimensions, felt like Sarah speaking through time. James looked around the waiting room, at the diverse group of people who had come together to support his daughter. Scientists and believers, skeptics and faithful, all united in hope. In that moment, he understood something fundamental about the false division he'd created between faith and reason. "The only guidance I need," he replied, "is what's best for Emily. Her mother taught her to believe in miracles. I taught her to trust in science. Right now, she needs both." Dr. Anderson nodded, understanding perfectly. The medical team would do their work, and those who believed would pray. Perhaps James thought that's what Sarah had meant about perfect love casting out fear. It wasn't about choosing between faith and doubt, but about embracing every possibility for love to work its purpose. As Dr. Anderson returned to the operating room, James found himself doing something he never expected. He sat down beside Father Michael in the quiet prayer corner. "I don't know how to pray," he admitted. The old priest smiled. "Nobody really does," he responded. "We just open our hearts to love and hope. The rest takes care of itself." In that moment, as the winter sun reached its zenith outside the hospital windows, James Wilson, renowned atheist, skeptic, and seeker of truth, bowed his head, not in prayer exactly, but in perfect unity with every person in that room, each hoping in their own way for the same miracle. If this story about faith, love, and redemption has touched your heart, please consider subscribing to join our storytelling community. Every subscription helps us continue sharing powerful narratives that remind us of our shared humanity and the transformative power of love. The complications from Emily's surgery cascaded like falling dominoes. What started as a minor rejection of the transplant evolved into a cascade of medical crises that tested the limits of both science and faith. Dr. Anderson's updates became more frequent and increasingly guarded, each one carrying the weight of diminishing options. In the ICU, Emily lay surrounded by machines, their steady beeping a mechanical chorus that seemed to mock the prayers being whispered in the chapel below. Her skin had taken on a translucent quality, making her look more like a porcelain doll than a 12-year-old girl. The sight of her small form among the tangle of tubes and monitors broke something in James that decades of rational thought had built. The medical team worked tirelessly, adjusting medications and monitoring vital signs with precision that would have normally impressed James's scientific mind. But now, watching his daughter fight for every breath, all his knowledge of cellular biology and medical statistics felt hollow. For the first time, he understood viscerally why people reached for faith when science reached its limits. Dr. Anderson didn't sugarcoat the situation. "The next 24 hours are critical," she explained, her professional demeanor softening with compassion. "Her immune system is in chaos. We're throwing everything we have at this, but..." She didn't need to finish the sentence. James could read the statistics in her eyes. The news spread through the hospital like a somber wave. Staff members who had supported Emily's case during the corruption scandal stopped by to offer encouragement. Even those who had once shunned James now nodded respectfully as they passed. their previous judgments dissolved in the face of a father's anguish. Father Michael maintained a quiet vigil in the hospital chapel, but occasionally visited Emily's room to sit with James. He didn't offer platitudes or try to convert James's fear into faith. Instead, he shared stories about Sarah's small moments of grace and humor that the old priest had witnessed during her years of volunteer work. She used to say that heaven was wherever love was strongest. Father Michael recalled, watching the monitors blink. I never quite understood what she meant until I saw how she lived, finding divine purpose in the most human moments. The words hung in the air, mixing with the rhythmic sounds of Emily's breathing machine. James found himself spending hours by Emily's bedside, reading aloud from her mother's prayer book. The words still felt foreign on his tongue, but somehow right for this moment. He noticed that Emily's vital signs seemed to stabilize slightly when he read, though his scientific mind insisted this was mere coincidence. Late one night, during the darkest hours, Emily briefly regained consciousness. Her eyes, so like Sarah's, focused on James with startling clarity. "Dad," she whispered through cracked lips, "I saw Mom." Before James could respond, she had slipped back into unconsciousness, leaving him to grapple with questions his rational mind couldn't answer. The medical staff spoke in hushed tones about declining numbers and failing responses to treatment. Each hour brought new challenges. Each intervention seemed less effective than the last. James recognized the look in Dr. Anderson's eyes, the same one he'd seen 5 years ago when Sarah's doctors had started running out of options. In his exhaustion, James began to experience moments of disorienting clarity. He found himself understanding, not intellectually but emotionally, why humans had invented the concept of prayer. It wasn't about changing outcomes, he realized, but about acknowledging that some things were beyond human control, a truth that both science and faith grappled with in their own ways. Mrs. Patterson organized a prayer vigil in the hospital garden, visible from Emily's ICU window. Even in the cold winter air, people gathered with candles, their small flames defying the darkness. James watched them from above, these people whose beliefs he had spent years critiquing, and felt a profound gratitude for their presence, not because he shared their faith, but because they shared his love for his daughter. In the deepest part of night, when the hospital corridors grew quiet and even the most devoted visitors had gone home, Emily's condition reached its critical point. Her vital signs began to falter, each dip of the numbers on the monitor striking James's heart like physical blows. Dr. Anderson was called in urgently, her face grave as she assessed the situation. "Her body is shutting down," she explained softly, the words falling like stones in the quiet room. "We can continue aggressive treatment, but you need to be prepared." She paused, her professional demeanor cracking slightly. "James, you need to be prepared for the possibility that we're reaching the end of what medicine can do." In that moment, James Wilson, the man who had built his career on rational thought and empirical evidence, felt his carefully constructed worldview crumble entirely. He found himself alone in the hospital chapel, a place he had criticized in countless lectures. The empty space echoed with his footsteps as he paced, his mind racing between memories of Sarah's death and the present crisis. "I don't know how to do this," he whispered to the silence. "I don't know how to believe." His words hung in the air, mingling with the faint scent of incense and decades of prayers. "Sarah, if you're anywhere, if there's anything." His voice broke. "Our daughter needs more than my doubt right now." It was there, in the dim light of the chapel, that James experienced what he would later struggle to explain in rational terms. Whether from exhaustion, grief, or something else entirely, he felt Sarah's presence with an intensity that defied his scientific understanding. Not as a ghost or supernatural occurrence, but as a memory so vivid it felt like reality. Faith isn't about being certain. He heard her voice in his memory, clear as the day she'd said it. It's about being willing to love even when you're not certain. The words, which had once sparked friendly debates between them, now struck him with new meaning. He found himself on his knees, not in prayer exactly, but in surrender to something larger than his own understanding. Meanwhile, in Emily's room, the monitors continued their ominous dance of declining numbers. The night nurse, a woman who had known Sarah during her volunteer days, quietly adjusted medications and whispered her own prayers. Outside the window, the prayer vigil continued, their candles now the only light in the darkness. James returned to Emily's bedside, carrying with him something he couldn't name, not faith in God, perhaps, but faith in love and the mystery that Sarah had always understood better than he had. He took his daughter's hand, noticing how it had grown so thin that her fingers seemed almost transparent. "Emily," he said softly, "I don't know if I believe in heaven, but I believe in love. And if love is enough, if it's what your mother always said it was, then you're surrounded by it right now. From everyone out there with their candles, from the nurses who knew your mom, from Father Michael's prayers." He squeezed her hand gently. "And most of all, from your mother and me." As if in response to his words, Emily's vital signs flickered, not improving but not declining further either. Dr. Anderson, checking the monitors, noted the stabilization with cautious professionalism. "Sometimes," she said carefully, "we see patients rally at moments like this. The next few hours will be crucial." James sat in the darkness, holding his daughter's hand, aware of the vigil outside, the prayers being offered, the medical team's dedication, and something else, something he had spent his career dismissing but now felt with undeniable clarity. Not God, perhaps, but the power of love to transcend human understanding, to connect people across the boundaries of belief and doubt, life and death. In this darkest moment, James Wilson, the great skeptic, found himself embracing mystery, not with the blind faith he had so long criticized, but with the humility of a man who had discovered that some truths lay beyond both belief and doubt. He had no idea if his daughter would survive the night, but he knew with sudden clarity that love, the kind Sarah had lived by and Emily had inherited, was real beyond any need for proof. The breakthrough came in the form of a weather-beaten cardboard box discovered in the hospital's old records room. While searching for additional evidence of Parker's corruption, Father Michael had stumbled upon a collection of Sarah's personal effects that had been stored away after her death. Among them was a sealed envelope addressed to James, with instructions to open it only if Emily ever faced a serious illness. Inside, James found a letter written in Sarah's familiar handwriting, along with detailed documentation of a trust fund she had secretly established for Emily's medical care. The letter began, "My dearest James, if you're reading this, it means our daughter needs more than science alone can provide. I've always known that your doubt and my faith would someday need to work together to protect her." Sarah had been more prescient than anyone could have imagined. Using her inheritance and careful investments, she had created a substantial medical trust for Emily, managed by a private firm with no connections to St. Mary's Hospital. The fund was more than sufficient to cover the experimental treatment Emily needed, along with any future medical expenses. But it was the letter accompanying the financial documents that shook James to his core. "I'm not leaving this fund as a testament to faith," Sarah had written. "I'm leaving it as a testament to love, the kind that plans ahead, that prepares for storms, that thinks beyond its own certainty. You taught me that, James, even if you never realized it. Your skepticism made my faith stronger because it taught me that love doesn't need proof to be real." The letter went on, revealing layers of Sarah that James had never fully understood. She wrote about how his questioning had deepened her faith rather than threatening it, how his dedication to truth had inspired her own pursuit of honesty within her beliefs. "Our differences were never obstacles," she wrote. "They were bridges we built between different ways of understanding the same truth." Included with the letter were journal entries Sarah had kept during her volunteer work, documenting not just the corruption she had discovered, but also the small miracles she had witnessed, moments of unexpected healing, inexplicable comfort, and human resilience. She had recorded them all with both faith and skepticism, noting medical explanations alongside spiritual interpretations. Father Michael, reading the materials with James in the hospital chapel, smiled through tears. "She told me once that she was keeping records for both of you, proof for the scientist and testimony for the believer. She knew someday Emily might need both." The old priest pulled out another envelope, this one containing Sarah's observations about Parker and the hospital board, dated right up to the day of her accident. The documentation was meticulous, revealing that Sarah had been building a case against the corruption for years. She had created a network of witnesses and gathered evidence, all while maintaining her role as a beloved volunteer. Her final entry, written the day she died, spoke of a breakthrough discovery about the misuse of charitable funds, information that had died with her until now. James sat in the chapel for hours, reading and rereading Sarah's words. He discovered that while he had been writing books debunking faith, She had been living a faith that encompassed both doubt and certainty, both question and answer. Her trust fund wasn't just financial planning, it was a message about the compatibility of faith and reason, love and logic. The immediate practical impact was significant. Emily could now receive the full course of treatment she needed without financial constraints. But the deeper impact on James was philosophical. Sarah had demonstrated that faith and doubt weren't opposing forces but complementary tools for understanding life's mysteries. In her final paragraphs, Sarah had written words that would forever change James's understanding of both faith and skepticism. "I'm not asking you to believe in God, James. I'm asking you to believe in the power of love to bridge all gaps between life and death, faith and doubt. Father and daughter, Emily has both our hearts within her. Let her show you how they can beat as one." As James shared these discoveries with the hospital's interim board, a new understanding emerged. Sarah's legacy wasn't just a secret fund or evidence of corruption, it was a blueprint for how faith and reason could work together in service of healing. Her careful documentation would help rebuild the hospital's charitable programs on a foundation of both compassion and accountability. The timing of this discovery felt to many like divine intervention, though James preferred to see it as Sarah's careful planning coming to fruition at exactly the right moment. Either way, it represented a turning point not just for Emily's treatment, but for the entire community's understanding of how faith and doubt could coexist in service of a greater purpose. The revelation of Sarah's trust fund and evidence catalyzed a transformation that rippled through the entire community. The hospital board, under interim leadership, called an emergency meeting that lasted into the early hours of the morning. By dawn, they had drafted a new charter for the hospital's charitable programs, one that explicitly prohibited discrimination based on religious beliefs while maintaining the institution's Catholic character. Robert Parker's final appearance at St. Mary's came not in handcuffs as many expected, but in an act of public confession that left the community stunned. Standing before a packed church, he revealed how his initial idealism had gradually corrupted into self-righteousness and greed. "I convinced myself that protecting the institution's reputation was more important than its mission," he admitted, his voice breaking. Sarah Wilson saw what I had become long before I did. The diocesan investigation, spurred by Sarah's evidence, expanded beyond St. Mary's to examine practices at other Catholic healthcare institutions. The findings led to wholesale reforms in how charitable funds were managed and distributed. Sarah's meticulous documentation became a template for new transparency protocols adopted across the diocese. Mrs. Patterson, once among James's harshest critics, became an unexpected bridge between the secular and religious communities. She organized a series of town hall meetings where people could share their experiences of being denied care due to religious discrimination. These sessions evolved into healing circles where faith and doubt could coexist in open dialogue. The medical staff, freed from the constraints of Parker's administration, began integrating more holistic approaches to patient care. Dr. Anderson established a groundbreaking program that allowed families to incorporate their own spiritual or philosophical practices into treatment plans without compromising medical protocols. She often cited Sarah's journals as inspiration for this balanced approach. Father Michael, though officially retired, found himself busier than ever as an advisor to the hospital's new ethics committee. His gentle wisdom helped guide the institution through its reformation, ensuring that changes preserved the essence of its mission while embracing a more inclusive approach. Sarah showed us that true faith isn't threatened by questions, he often said. It's strengthened by them. The story reached national media, but not as the scandal many expected. Instead, it became a case study in institutional redemption. Other religious hospitals sent representatives to study St. Mary's new model of inclusive care. Academics began citing the case in discussions of how faith-based institutions could adapt to serve diverse communities while maintaining their spiritual identity. Perhaps the most profound transformation occurred in the daily interactions between community members. The artificial barriers between believers and skeptics began to dissolve as people recognized their common humanity. Prayer groups welcomed doubters, and academic discussions made room for spiritual perspectives. Sarah's vision of a community united by love rather than divided by belief began to take shape. Local businesses, inspired by the hospital's reformation, launched their own initiatives to bridge community divides. The bookstore next to campus started hosting monthly discussions where religious texts and scientific papers were studied side by side. The cafe where Sarah had often volunteered created a pay-it-forward program for families struggling with medical bills. Young people in the community found particular inspiration in the story. Emily's classmates organized an annual interfaith service project in Sarah's memory, bringing together students from religious and secular backgrounds to work on community improvement projects. Their slogan, borrowed from Sarah's journals, became "Love builds bridges, not walls." The hospital itself underwent a physical transformation to reflect its new philosophy. The chapel was renovated to include a quiet reflection space welcoming to all faiths and none. Sarah's favorite peace lilies were planted in the hospital garden, surrounding a simple plaque that read, "In honor of Sarah Wilson, who taught us that truth and love speak all languages." As the changes unfolded, James watched with a mixture of awe and understanding. He saw how his wife's wisdom had created a template for genuine dialogue between faith and reason. The community wasn't just healing from corruption, it was evolving into something new, a place where different ways of seeing the world could enrich rather than threaten each other. Robert Parker's final act before leaving town was to establish a scholarship fund for students interested in studying both religious ethics and scientific research. He named it the Sarah Wilson Memorial Scholarship, with the stated goal of fostering dialogue between faith and science. While it couldn't erase his past actions, it suggested that even the deepest wounds could lead to healing transformations. The story of St. Mary's transformation became known beyond their small community, but its true impact was felt in countless small moments, in the way nurses now felt comfortable praying with patients who asked while providing excellent medical care, in how doctors learned to respect both faith and reason in their treatment approaches, and in how a community learned that the greatest miracles often happen when people open their hearts to different ways of understanding the world. Emily's recovery, when it came, progressed with the same steady determination that characterized everything about her. Day by day, her vital signs strengthened, her blood work improved, and her body began accepting the transplant. Dr. Anderson called it a textbook recovery, though her eyes suggested she saw something more than just medical science at work. The day Emily was strong enough to sit up in bed, she asked to visit the hospital chapel. James wheeled her there himself, past walls now adorned with both medical achievements and testimonials of faith. In the quiet space, Emily placed a peace lily grown from a cutting of Sarah's original plant beside the altar. For Mom, she said simply, who knew both sides of every story. The hospital's transformation continued to unfold around them during Emily's recovery. The new charitable care program, restructured with Sarah's principles at its core, began accepting applications from families regardless of their beliefs. James found himself serving on the oversight committee, his analytical skills helping ensure both compassion and accountability in the distribution of funds. Father Michael, though officially retired, became a regular visitor during Emily's recovery. He brought not just spiritual comfort, but stories about Sarah that helped James understand his wife in new ways. "She used to say that you two were perfect together," the priest told him one afternoon, "because you both loved truth more than being right." The community's support manifested in unexpected ways. Mrs. Patterson organized a meal train that brought dinner every night, each dish accompanied by a note sharing memories of Sarah. Emily's classmates created a study group that met in her hospital room, filling the sterile space with teenage laughter and normal conversation. The normalcy proved as healing as any medicine. Dr. Anderson integrated Emily's case into her research on holistic recovery approaches, noting how the combination of cutting-edge medical treatment and strong community support had contributed to her healing. "We're learning," she told James, "that healing happens on multiple levels. Sarah understood that long before we did." As Emily grew stronger, she began spending time in the children's ward, reading to younger patients from her mother's prayer book. James watched her one afternoon, struck by how much she resembled Sarah in her gentle interaction with a frightened young patient. She had inherited her mother's gift for bridging worlds, offering comfort without demanding belief. The day Emily was discharged, the hospital staff organized a celebration that brought together people from all parts of their journey. Medical professionals stood alongside prayer group members, academics mingled with church volunteers, and former skeptics chatted with devoted believers. James looked around the room and saw what Sarah had always envisioned: a community united by love rather than divided by belief. On their first night home, Emily showed James her journal entries from the darkest days of her illness. Among them was a letter to her mother that brought tears to his eyes. "Mom, I think Dad finally understands what you always said, that love is the biggest kind of truth there is. You can prove it with science or faith, but in the end it proves itself." James hung Sarah's letter from the trust fund on his office wall at Riverside Academy, opposite his academic credentials. Students often asked about it, leading to deep discussions about the relationship between faith and reason. He no longer gave lectures debunking religious beliefs. Instead, he taught courses exploring how different ways of understanding truth could complement rather than contradict each other. The changes weren't just philosophical. James found himself attending occasional services at St. Mary's, not because he had found faith in God, but because he had found faith in community. He sat in the back, still wrestling with questions, but no longer feeling the need to have all the answers. Emily sat beside him, holding both her mother's prayer book and her father's hand a bridge between worlds, just as Sarah had been. 1 year after Emily's recovery, the community gathered at St. Mary's Hospital Garden for the dedication of the Sarah Wilson Memorial Center for Integrated Care. The new wing would house both state-of-the-art medical facilities and spaces for spiritual and emotional support, embodying Sarah's vision of holistic healing. James stood at the podium, looking out at faces that had become familiar during their journey. Emily sat in the front row, healthy and vibrant, her mother's prayer book in her lap. Father Michael, though now fully retired, had returned for the occasion, his presence a reminder of how far they'd all come. A year ago, James began, "I stood in this same garden, watching people hold candlelight vigils for my daughter. I was a man who believed only in what could be proven, who had built a career questioning faith. Today I stand before you not as a convert, but as someone who has learned that truth comes in many languages." He shared how Sarah had created not just a trust fund, but a bridge between worlds. How her foresight had saved not just Emily's life, but the soul of an institution. How her understanding of both faith and doubt had created a legacy that continued to transform lives. Emily joined him at the podium, her strong voice carrying across the garden. "Mom used to tell me that love is like light. It doesn't matter if you explain it through science or faith, it still illuminates the darkness. This center will be a place where all kinds of light are welcome." The ceremony concluded with a simple gesture that brought tears to many eyes. Emily and James planted a peace lily garden, each plant representing a different aspect of healing medical science: faith, community support, and love. In the center, they placed a plaque with words from Sarah's journal: "In every heart, truth and love speak the same language." Dr. Anderson announced a new research initiative studying the impact of integrated care approaches, while Father Michael blessed the space with words that acknowledged both the mystery of faith and the wonder of science. The gathered crowd included former skeptics and believers, all united in the understanding that healing comes in many forms. Later that evening, James and Emily sat in their backyard, watching the sunset. Emily's journal lay open on her lap, and James noticed she had written something new. "What are you working on?" he asked. She smiled, a smile so like her mother's it made his heart ache. "I'm writing about how Mom's love proved both you and God right," she said. "You taught me to question everything, and she taught me to believe in something bigger than questions. Together you taught me that love is the biggest truth of all." James looked at his daughter, healthy and wise beyond her years, and felt Sarah's presence in the gentle evening air. He had not found God in their journey, but he had found something perhaps more precious: the understanding that love transcends the boundaries between faith and doubt, between the provable and the mysterious. The Sarah Wilson Memorial Center would go on to become a model for healthcare institutions nationwide, demonstrating how faith and science could work together in service of healing. But its greatest legacy was in the small, daily moments, in the comfort found by patients and families, in the bridges built between different ways of seeing the world, and in the continuing story of a father and daughter who learned that love speaks all languages. As night fell, Emily read aloud from her mother's prayer book, while James listened with the quiet respect of someone who had learned that truth comes in many forms. Between them, Sarah's peace lilies bloomed in the moonlight, a living testament to the power of love to bridge all divides. The story of the Wilsons in St. Mary's Hospital became not just a tale of healing and redemption, but a reminder that the greatest miracles often happen when we open our hearts to different ways of understanding the world. In the end, it was Sarah's legacy that showed them all that love, whether viewed through the lens of faith or reason, remains the most powerful force for transformation. If this story about faith, love, and redemption has touched your heart, please take a moment to support our storytelling journey. Subscribe to join our community and be the first to receive more powerful narratives like this. Share this video with friends and family who might find comfort and inspiration in James and Emily's journey. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. How has this story affected you? Would you like to hear what happens next in part 2? Your engagement helps us continue creating meaningful content that bridges hearts and minds.